All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. On the Google Classroom, I have a little on the stream. I have a packet of notes that kind of deal with Thomas Jefferson and his presidency. All right. So if you need a copy of that, you need to print that out. You have it. But what I'm going to do over the course of probably 3 days is go through the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Just so you know, we've hit a point in this course where I guess we could describe it as like a new era in history. So we just learned about the 1790s. And I would make the argument that the 1790s, I mean, if there was like one word that came to mind, it would be division. America was super politically divided during the 1790s. But what we're going to see is we're going to see a drastic change in direction starting right around this year where we pick up 1800. So what we see is that the division in the 1790s came because the two parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, were sort of at each other's throats. And you could really make an argument that for most of the 1790s, the Federalists, the party of Washington and Hamilton and Adams, they had control. The Federalists were driving the ship, and the Democratic Republicans were doing everything they could to try to battle against the party in power. But starting in 1801, actually, what we see is that the party of Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, they take over the presidency. And they control the presidency for 24 years straight. 8 years of Jefferson, 8 years of Madison, and 8 years of Monroe. So as powerful as the Federalists were in the 1790s, the Federalists very much shrink in terms of their power starting in 1800, 1801. So the first thing I would like you to look at is this first heading here where it says the results of the presidential election of 1800. Now in 1800, President John Adams was running for re-election. But those Alien and Sedition Acts, which limited the rights of the press and threatened the safety of foreigners, that caused many people to kind of have a falling out with John Adams. John Adams expected to serve a second term. So when the results of the election came out, John Adams was very disappointed. Let's look at the results. Now remember, early in American history, we had a presidential election system where person who came in first place became president, person who came in second place became vice president. In 1800, we had a constitutional crisis. If we look at the results, John Adams came in third, so he's out. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, the two Democratic Republican candidates, finished with the same amount of electoral votes. So what that meant was that neither of those men had a majority. And in our Constitution, it said that if nobody gets a majority in the Electoral College, or if there is a tie in the Electoral College, the election then goes to the Congress for a tiebreaker. Now, on its surface, you look at these results, you should say, well, it's obvious. Thomas Jefferson should become the next president. But it wasn't so obvious. And what we see is that at this time in history, there were 16 states in the U.S. And in this tiebreaker system, you had to get the support of a majority of states in Congress. All right, so let's move under here. Let's see what happens and how this tie worked itself out. Let's go to right here where it says tiebreaker. In the House of Representatives, this tie was broken on the 36th ballot. Let's really think about this, right? That means on the first ballot, there were 8 states for Burr, 8 states for Jefferson. Second ballot, 8-8. 10th ballot, 8-8. 30th ballot, 8-8. So we were at like a legitimate stalemate regarding breaking this tie to figure out who was going to become our next president. Now, there was one man who behind the scenes had the ability to break this tie, and that was Alexander Hamilton. Now, Alexander Hamilton was not directly involved in this election, but Alexander Hamilton was considered to be the most important Federalist in the entire country. Now, Hamilton knew that no matter what he decided, his party was not going to hold on to the presidency. But Hamilton had enough control over the Federalists in Congress to basically tell them, all right, do we want Jefferson to be president or do we want Burr to be president? Now, Hamilton and Jefferson disagreed on every major political issue. But Hamilton said, I respect Jefferson as a man. I think that if Jefferson is president, we can trust him to do the right thing. However, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had a long history because they were both from New York City. And Hamilton, he told people, I know Burr. Burr is a scoundrel. You cannot trust this guy. Burr is a snake. The guy doesn't have the guy has no values at all. He doesn't really care about anything. The only thing he cares about is himself. So what Hamilton did was he convinced the state of Delaware to change their vote from Burr to Jefferson, giving Jefferson the presidency. I think a few of you out there could probably tell me, anybody know what ends up happening a few years later between Quinn, Hamilton, and Burr?
There's a duel, and Hamilton gets shot and killed.
Yeah, so Aaron Burr, at the time, the sitting vice president of the United States, murders Aaron Burr in a duel. And then, on a side note, Aaron Burr, to escape the charge, he rides out to the frontier, attempts to steal land from Spain, and start his own country where he is the dictator. That did not work for Aaron Burr. And he basically died in obscurity, as a pretty much big nobody. So Aaron Burr, this guy has a pretty interesting life. And the one thing that we know about Burr is that he was universally hated by all of the founding fathers because they viewed him as not a noble man, not a guy with firm principles. So what we did after this election was we actually amended our Constitution because we very quickly realized that this first place, second place system for president and vice president was not working very well. So we passed the 12th Amendment saying that when you run for president, you actually choose who you want to be your vice president. And this is the system that we still use today. When Joe Biden was running for president, he chose Kamala Harris. When Donald Trump was running for president in 2016, he picked Mike Pence. So when you voted for Biden, you got both of them. When you voted for Trump, you got both of them. And this was a very easy fix that had to happen very early on in our system. So let's read some primary source Let's read a little primary source document here together. So this is a letter written by Alexander Hamilton, and he is writing to a friend about the election of 1800 and the tie. So let's read this together. This is Hamilton. My opinion is, after mature reflection, that if Jefferson and Burr come with equal votes to the House of Representatives, the former, Jefferson, ought to be preferred by the Federalists. Hamilton says, Mr. Jefferson is respectably known in Europe. Mr. Burr, not so much. Mr. Jefferson is a man of easy fortune. Mr. Burr, I believe, is bankrupt behind redemption. All right. Let's go down to this underlined part. He says, Mr. Jefferson is a man of fair character for probity. Mr. Jefferson, though too revolutionary in his notions, is a lover of liberty. So he's saying, Jefferson, I disagree with some things, but I know him and I know what he stands for and I can trust him. Then he says, Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself, right? And this is the most important part. Mr. Burr will be content with nothing short of permanent power. So Hamilton legitimately believes that if Burr became president, he would try to become the dictator of America. And we know from the founding generation that that was the number one fear of the founding fathers, to elect the wrong person as president who would become the king of America. Hamilton thought that Burr was capable of that. All right, now, at the bottom here, Hamilton, the politician, Hamilton says, we ought to seek some advantages from our situation. So what he's saying is, Hamilton's saying, if I break this tie and give the presidency to Jefferson, I will have control. I can convince Jefferson to do what I want because I'm going to be the one who gives him the presidency. So let's go down here. So there's three things that Hamilton says that if maybe the Federalists could get if they, convince Jefferson, that basically we'll give you the presidency if you give us something in return. Number one, the continuance of a neutral plan. So Hamilton says we want to maintain neutrality. We have to convince Jefferson it's not the right thing to do to ally with France. Number two, the preservation of our present system of public credit. So Hamilton wants to make sure that even though Jefferson is president, that Hamilton's financial plan stays in place. And number 3, the maintenance and gradual increase of our Navy. So Hamilton says, we've been building up our Navy in case we have to get into some kind of naval war. Let's make sure that we don't take away those naval boats. So Hamilton is scheming. We'll give Jefferson the presidency, but we'll make him promise to keep these 3 things. This is a huge topic when it comes to the AP exam. The AP exam loves asking about the Revolution of 1800. So Thomas Jefferson called his election, his own election, the Revolution of 1800. And you have to understand why. Why did Jefferson think that this was a monumental moment in American history, his election? Okay, let's read this word for word together. The Revolution of 1800. Power was peacefully transferred in the executive branch from the Federalist Party to the Democratic Republican Party for the first time, and it was done peacefully. In the history of the world, when countries go from one leader to the next, it is almost always done at this time in history through violence. So there's an election, the person who loses the election refuses to accept the results, there's a civil war that breaks out, and then democracy is over. That is the way that democracies had played out prior to the United States. So being that Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800, and John Adams said, hey, I wish you luck, and we don't agree on anything, but you now have the power and I'm willing to give it up. That was revolutionary in history. And that was something that Jefferson said, most countries can't do this. In our country, we have elections, we respect the results of our elections, and if you lose the election, you give up power, and you do it in a peaceful way. So that's very important. The second bullet point here, the second part that Jefferson considered revolutionary is that there was a change in the philosophy and style of the presidency. Jefferson believed that Washington and Adams had acted too stuck up as president. And Jefferson said, I think that as president, you should be acting normal. Act like a common man, shake people's hands, invite anyone who wants to come to the White House, answer the door yourself and let them in. So Jefferson wants to be president and act like more of a normal, average citizen, even though he is president. Get rid of the fancy carriages, get rid of the fancy parties, and let's really strip this office down and make it as simple as possible. The third bullet point. Jefferson considered his election a second American Revolution. He said, we're going to be more democratic. We're going to give more power to the people, all right? And we're going to really focus on those principles of 1776, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So Jefferson thinks that stylistically, his presidency is going to be different than the 2 men who came before him, okay? Now, very briefly, even though this isn't something you would ever get asked on an exam, I want to spend just a little bit of time on Jefferson the man. Who was Thomas Jefferson? I find Jefferson intriguing. There are some times that I love Jefferson, and there are some times that I hate Jefferson. I think that he is a great figure in American history, but as a man, he is an enigma. He is a hard guy to figure out. And we also know that he is a man of contradiction. He often says one thing and does another. Okay, so let's go through a little bit about this man. So Thomas Jefferson was the founding father with the most wide-ranging knowledge and curiosity. And what I mean by that is this guy was interested in a lot of different topics. He's involved. He loves science. He loves farming. He loves gardening. He loves astronomy. He loves politics. Like, you name a subject, Jefferson loves it. So he's the most well-rounded knowledge-wise when it comes to founding fathers. He spoke English, French, Italian, and Latin, and he learned how to read Greek and Spanish. So back in this time period, the more educated you were, the more languages you learned. If you wanted to read a Spanish book, you actually would learn Spanish to be able to read the book. Okay, you would have to be able to read Latin to read ancient Roman text. You'd have to learn how to read Greek to read ancient Greek texts. So Jefferson was an extremely bright man. He loved music, played the violin, science, nature, inventing, gardening, art, everything. The guy loves every subject, right? He loved ideas. He loved to read. He was obsessed with the Enlightenment, okay? So these Enlightenment philosophers, this shaped his entire life and all his views about government. He married a woman named Martha Jefferson, but his wife died very young. And on her deathbed, Martha Jefferson made him promise that he would never remarry. Thomas Jefferson never remarried, but he had a decades-long relationship with one of his female slaves. Okay. Side note, the slave that Jefferson had his affair with was his dead wife's half-sister. See if you can wrap your head around that. So the slave, Sally Hemings, that Jefferson had this long affair with, her father was white. Martha Jefferson's father was white. So Sally Hemings, the slave that Jefferson had an affair with, was the result of a mixed-race relationship between a slave master and a African-American female slave. And the daughter, Sally, also had an affair with a white slave owner. So it's kind of a complicated, disgusting, sexually exploitative system that basically continued from generation to generation. Jefferson was the governor of Virginia. He hated being governor, and he did an awful job during the American Revolution. If you ever get a chance, I've been there once. Thomas Jefferson's home is absolutely beautiful, and it's still preserved to this day. He built it on top of a hill in Charlottesville, Virginia, where the University of Virginia is, and he called it Monticello. He spent his entire life fixing it up and making it look like this Italian, French, European villa. Today you can visit it and walk through it and check it out, but the guy was obsessed with architecture. Even when he became president, he renovated the White House to make it more aesthetically beautiful. All right, now.
I've been there.
You've been there, Ab? Did you like it?
Yeah. Yeah, it was really nice.
Yeah, so I would say, out of all the founding fathers, the Jefferson House, that's the one you would want to go to.
We were visiting colleges down south from my sister, and we stopped on our way back up, and it was really nice.
And now here's the thing, Ab, right? Jefferson claimed to be a man of the people. I love the people, but he built his house on this steep hill far away from everyone. So
I have to drive all the way up there.
And actually, to get up to his home, you have to take this trolley where they take you up this steep.
Yeah.
Right? So it's cool that you were there, Ab. That's awesome. Fun fact about Monticello: it costs $18 to visit. So if you pay with a $20, they give you a $2 bill. And whose face is on the $2 bill? Thomas Jefferson. Okay. All right. So let's talk about Jefferson's inauguration. That's when he was sworn in as president. Another fun fact. John Adams was so mad that he lost the presidential election that he did not stay for the inauguration. There have only been 4 presidents in U.S. history who have not stayed after losing the election for the next president's swearing in. John Adams did not stay. John Quincy Adams did not stay. Andrew Johnson, the president after Abraham Lincoln, did not stay to greet the next president. And you guessed it, President Trump did not stay to greet Joe Biden. So it has happened before, but it's pretty rare for the president not to stay for the incoming president's swearing in. Now, Thomas Jefferson, I would argue, gave the first ever very famous inaugural speech. Thomas Jefferson hated public speaking, and he never actually gave this speech in person. But he wrote it down. He was a great writer, and he submitted it to Congress. There are a few elements to Jefferson's inaugural speech that I want to go over with you because it kind of clues you into what he views as important. Let's take a look at the very beginning. He says, "A rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land." That first part is important because when he calls America a rising nation, he basically says America is a country on the rise, and I interpret that another way. He views this as America is bound to grow in size. And we know that during Jefferson's presidency, one of his key moments is the purchase of Louisiana. So even from the beginning, he says that America is a rising nation that is going to grow larger and larger. That's important. This second bulleted point here, where I have it bolded and underlined, he says, "To you then, gentlemen, who are charged with the sovereign functions of legislation, I look with encouragement for that with guidance and support which may steer us with the safety of vessel." I don't care so much about the last part, but he is making a specific reference to Congress. Jefferson, as president, he eagerly wants to work with the Congress and get things passed. So in a Republican government, in a government where you have like Republican structures, the Congress is supposed to have the most power, and the president is supposed to do what the Congress says. And Jefferson kind of acknowledges that in that second piece. I would argue this is by far the most famous part of Jefferson's inaugural. He says, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. This is a very important point. The idea is that just because you disagree with somebody does not mean that they are wrong, does not mean that they are a bad person. Jefferson is saying that smart people have differences of opinion all the time, and that doesn't mean that they have to be enemies. That's a good lesson for modern politics. Then, very famously, Jefferson says, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. So he's basically saying, I am everybody's president. Okay, and almost every president in modern times has stolen this from Jefferson to say that, hey, I ran as a Republican, I ran as a Democrat, but now that I am president for all Americans. And that's something throughout your life you will hear every president say, because that is usually how they feel. That's all I really, and then one thing I want to point out at the bottom here, Jefferson points out that he wants a wise and frugal government. So what he means by that is that he wants to cut government spending, and he does not want the government to be like this huge thing that like spends a lot of money and raises the taxes on everybody. He thinks that the government should be lean, it should be limited, and it shouldn't be overly expensive. So that's a very important key understanding of Jefferson. Now, this will probably be the last thing that we go through today. I would argue that in the notes so far, I would argue this is the most important section that we've gone through so far. So historians call the beliefs and the philosophy of Thomas Jefferson Jeffersonian democracy. This is a topic that I know in AP history, I think he gives an essay on this topic. Like, what was the governing philosophy of Jefferson as president? And what I did was I made a series of bullet points that basically go through all the key philosophical beliefs of Jefferson. And I'll go through each one by one. And I would say this is probably as far as we're going to get today, this page here. Okay, so let me just go through them briefly. If you're confused by anything, please stop me. You can ask me. Okay, be aware that Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe are presidents all in a row, and they all had Jeffersonian principles. So for 24 years, you could argue that a Jeffersonian president was in office, okay? Next, Jeffersonians believed that the federal government should be weak, frugal, and simple, and you have to watch it closely. So Jefferson believes that the government by nature is going to be corrupt, and that by nature, the government's going to try to expand its powers. Jefferson says you have to keep the government small and weak. Okay, this is a very important point. Jefferson believes in a strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So basically, the government can only do what the Constitution says it can do. So none of this Hamiltonian, flexible interpretation, none of that. Jeffersonians believed very strongly in something called states' rights, right? That the federal government should be weak, but state and local governments should be strong. In the aftermath of the Alien and Sedition Acts, Jefferson argues that states have the right to nullify a law passed by the United States. Just like the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson believes in people's individual rights. So the rights of people should come before anything else, right? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, especially the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. So Jefferson is the Alien and Sedition Acts are very fresh in his head. Jefferson hates the idea of the U.S. government passing any taxes. So can anybody out there remind me, what tax was passed by Alexander Hamilton that is going to be removed by Thomas Jefferson? What was the only product taxed by the U.S. government during the presidency of George Washington? I'll give you a hint. There was a rebellion about it. Abby.
Whiskey.
Yep. So when Thomas Jefferson takes office, he says, yeah, you know that liquor tax? It's gone. All right. This is a kind of an interesting one. Jefferson believes in decreasing the size of the Army and the Navy. He believes this for two reasons. Number one, he thinks that the Army and Navy are expensive, and he wants to cut people's taxes. Secondly, he thinks that the bigger the Army gets, the more likely it is to become corrupt. So if you're Jefferson, you believe that state militias are just fine for defense. We don't need a U.S. Army. And if we have an army, that army's probably going to take away people's rights. Jefferson wants to pay off the national debt. He thinks that debt is bad. That whole building credit thing, he's like, just get your debt and pay it. This is a very important one. All right, so star next to this one. Jefferson's goal, his goal had always been to turn America into an agrarian utopia, a farming utopia. He thinks that farmers are way better than any other people in America. So as a result, he wants to turn America into a nation of small farmers, where everybody has their own little plot of land, everyone works for themselves, and you produce food or other products that are for the good of everybody. So his vision for America is a country where everyone has their own land and everyone farms. Okay. We're going to go down to Thomas Jefferson hated city people. He hated businessmen. He hated bankers. He hated anybody involved in finance. So he didn't trust these types of people to do the right thing. He thought they were greedy, and he thought they were all out for themselves. So he said, the more farmers we have, the better. The more businessmen, bankers, and stock traders we have, the worse we are. Another biggie. Thomas Jefferson is extremely pro-Western expansion. Jefferson wants to grow the size of the country as quickly and as largely as possible. So Jefferson referred to this very famously as his empire of liberty. He says the more opportunity Americans have to spread out, the better we are. Like the more space and the more freedom and the more farming we will have. But if we get all jumbled up and we get too populated where we don't have enough room for everyone to live, that's what's going to lead us down the wrong path. Jefferson was not a very religious man. He believed in a separation of church and state. So he legitimately believed that like people should have freedom of religion and that the government should have no say in any kind of religion. So Jefferson is known as being one of the early champions for freedom of religion in America because he himself was not particularly religious. Let's go down to, I want to skip this one. All right. Let's go down to where it says foreign policy. Jefferson was pro-France, but you have to understand that when Jefferson is taking over as president, anybody know the name of that short guy who's known for being a dictator in France? What was his name? The real short dude. Begins with an N? Quinn.
Napoleon.
Napoleon. So at the same time that Jefferson is being elected president, Napoleon is taking over as the military dictator of France. So as much as Jefferson liked France and the French Revolution, once Napoleon takes over, France isn't our friend anymore, okay? So Jefferson wants to avoid alliances with foreign countries, and he still thinks that Britain is our number one enemy, though. All right, we're going to end on this today. The core belief. What was Jefferson's core belief in terms of government? Simplicity. Keep the government simple. So, for example, Jefferson said, don't put my face on any coins. Don't celebrate my birthday. Like, he goes, all this ceremonial bullcrap like that you would do for a king, Jefferson said, I don't want any of it. I'm just a normal man, just like, just like all those ordinary average people out there. Jefferson hated public speaking. So he said, as president, I will give no speeches. Everything that I will give to the public will be in written form. And published in the newspaper. And then he just believed in a very casual tone in office. Like he said, if you want to talk to me, knock on the front door of the White House. Okay. And I'll answer the door myself. Okay. It was a much simpler time back then. He says, I'll shake hands with anybody. Right. When we have dinner, there's no assigned seating, no fancy, nothing fancy, just normal average food, no fancy dinners. We're going to keep things casual. If I go somewhere on a horse, there's going to be no carriage. I'm just going to ride the horse. Even my clothing. Jefferson says, I'm going to wear average clothing that the average person would wear because as president, I am the same or equal to everybody else out there. Okay. So everybody, I think we went through a lot today. I think, I don't want to overburden you, but we went through Jefferson's election. We went through his inauguration, and we went through his philosophy about government. Before we leave today, is there anything that we think we need clarification on before we end the lesson, or we think we're good? So are we starting to get a gist of what this Jefferson guy is all about? Do we see how Jefferson is a little bit different than somebody like John Adams and George Washington? You should see a very big difference between these two men, their personalities, and how they run the country. All right, everybody, I'm going to end my stream there. Thank you. Good job. Thank you for participating. And how about is tomorrow Wednesday? Tomorrow is Wednesday. So, guys, I am not going to stream tomorrow. Tomorrow is a remote student only day. So if you're a remote student, you can stream in. I'll have a link for you. But if you are a hybrid student, I will see you on Thursday. Okay? Does everyone understand that? Everybody cool? Okay, guys. I'll see you. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Bye.
See you guys.